Have you ever wondered what the areas outside of land look like on a map? For real though, if you take a globe or a map, you can see the land and the mountains and everything. But if you look at the oceans, you'll see that it's just empty. It's just blank. It turns out it's not too far of a representation of what we actually know about our oceans. That is not very much. We've been mapping bits and pieces of our oceans here and there, but it's only through the Seabed 2030 project that we're now trying to aggregate all this data together into one global map. So today I'm sitting down with Jamie McMichael-Phillips, the director of the Seabed 2030 project. The goal is to map all our oceans by 2030. Now, when someone says map something, I tend to have a few follow-up questions, like what do you mean map it? Isn't there already something? And how do we do it? And what's the purpose? So this is a conversation about just that, how a lot of people are working to map all our oceans by 2030. You can say it's a deep dive into ocean mapping, pun intended. Before that, this episode is sponsored by SatCamp. SatCamp is a conference held in Colorado from October 1st to October 3rd, 2024. It's a bit of a different kind of conference than what you might be used to, though. The main goal of SatCamp is to bring together earth science and geospatial practitioners. Instead of taking place in the bowels of some random hotel or conference center, SatCamp is situated in the foothills of the Rockies in Boulder, Colorado. It has the panels and expert talks of your favorite geospatial conference with ample opportunities to go deeper with those presenters over a bike ride, climbing, hiking, or birding. It's also capped at 75 people, so you'll forge meaningful, lasting connections with professionals across that sector and at all stages in their careers. If you're in the geospatial industry or want to get into it, I recommend you at least consider going to SatCamp. The focus is on spending time with the other people there, fostering connections rather than listening to a talk that you would have watched on YouTube later anyways. I was able to go last year for the first edition and have joked that it's more of a summer camp for grown-up map nerds than a conference. You can also decide to support scholarships, allowing people who may not have been able to afford joining to also come. I actually directly benefited from that last year, as coming from Europe would have otherwise been a lot more costly. If you've listened to this podcast, you know how much I enjoy a good conversation. And this is a place, SatCamp is a place to have many of those with the people in the same field. So if you're interested, head over to satcamp.xyz to learn more about the conference, the venue, and the scholarships. I'll have links in the show notes. I don't know if you know, I actually like starting these conversations, asking the same question every single time. I like asking people how they would describe themselves. So I'm quite curious, how would you describe yourself?
My name's Jamie McMichael-Phillips. I'm a hydrographic surveyor by profession. I spent many years in the Royal Navy as a hydrographic surveyor and plenty of time at sea gathering information for two purposes, primarily for safety of navigation and when I was in the Navy also for defense use. I'm now a civilian. I head up the Seabed 2030 project, which is a collaboration between the Nippon Foundation of Japan and an outfit called JEBCA, and I'll explain more about that later. But my role now is to run a project that aims to inspire 100% mapping of the seafloor by the year 2030.
Can you explain to me a little bit more about what Seabed 2030 is? So it's mapping the oceans by the year 2030. This is a really naive question, but isn't it mapped already? Or like, what is the state of mapping the oceans today?
It's a great
And
question.
I'm going to caveat that with the fact that I understand mapping quite a bit. I work with satellite images. I understand how you map land. It's pretty easy today. You can send a satellite up into space. You can fly a plane, and you can put them like actually at any height that you want, which is really convenient. So you can put a camera on a satellite, you can put a camera on a plane, and they look down. And there's this really cool thing, which is that the atmosphere doesn't attenuate the signal very much. So you can really capture whatever you want, however far you are. So you want to map a whole continent, you just put a satellite far enough. My understanding is you can't really quite do that for the oceans. So where are we today, and why? What is Seabed 2030 trying to solve?
Well, you make a good point about the power of satellites, but you also acknowledge that has been predominantly used for land mapping. But 71% of the surface of the Earth is ocean. And to date, we've only mapped 26.1% of the ocean to satisfactory standards. So there is a huge, huge, huge amount of the ocean that we're still going to get on a map. And the challenge is that light does not penetrate very far into the ocean. So if you're using the visual spectrum in terms of satellite uh, telemetry, or if you're using cameras mounted on aircraft, you're not going to get very far into that deep grey part of the water space. So we are pretty much stuck at the moment with using sonar technology, deep water sonar systems, either attached to the hull of surface ships or attached to submersibles to go down and map the ocean. And that is a long, slow process, bearing in mind that the ocean size is 362 million square kilometers. So vast, vast tracts of ocean still to map.
My understanding is like one of the main challenges and the reason why we haven't mapped as well, I'm trying to understand here, is that we can you were saying we have deep water sonar that we can put on, autonomous vehicles or some boats. My understanding is the swath, so the amount of area that we can see is very, very narrow compared to like what we're able to do today with like geosynchronous satellites even that can see like a third of the world. And on top of that, most of the earth is water. So we have a much larger area to map in the first place than land. And we're using tools that can see a much, much narrower field of view at a time. Is that a fair assessment?
It is a fair assessment. And of course, as humankind, we've been very, very good at looking up. We space exploration has been enormous since the 50s and 60s, but we have not been particularly good at looking down at our own planet and into our own ocean. And it is scale that the systems exist. In fact, if you added up all the platforms that carry those deep water systems, we have got enough to map our ocean in the next 7 years. But it's mobilizing those assets. It's bearing in mind that a lot of them belong to industry, a lot of them belong to government. They are already operating on discrete tasks for all sorts of reasons, whether it's cables and pipelines, whether it's exploration for in detailed areas or in very specific parts of the ocean, whether it's habitat mapping, ecosystems mapping, or safety and navigation. But what we do need is to scale them up and get them moving into the deeper parts of the ocean, because that's where we lack the knowledge at the moment.
This is going to be again a very high level question. Why do we need to map all of the seabed? So again, I understand land. I understand so many of the applications. That's the world that I'm in. There's agriculture. There's urban growth prediction. All these things. Like people are on land, so I see many of the reasons why we would want to map land. What are some of the reasons that we might want to monitor and map the seabed?
I'm going to go back to your point you made about agriculture. If you are planning an agricultural venture, you're going to plant seeds, fields of wheat or corn, or you're going to plant trees. You need to know where you're going to start. You need that three-dimensional map. You're not going to build or farm on a rocky cliff face. You want something flat. You want something that's well drained. You want something that's irrigated well, and you start with a map and you look at where you're going to plan your venture. At the moment, with only 26.1% of the ocean mapped, we don't have that three-dimensional reference frame to do all the things that we want to do in the oceans. And that might be safety and navigation. It might be modeling for ocean circulation and climate. It might be planning and monitoring for tsunami, inundation, and storm surge. It might be looking at other Earth processes. It might be at a much more micro scale, looking at maritime heritage. What is out in the ocean? What do we need to protect? What habitats do we need to protect? What ecosystems do we need to protect? And actually, without that three-dimensional reference frame, we are not doing ourselves any favors in being able to determine what is out there, where we need to operate, and how we need to reference those operations.
What does mapping the seabed and the oceans actually mean? Because there's you can have it can mean very different things in terms of the resolution that you're mapping. There's the seabed, but there's all the water that's above it. And I'm sure there's a little bit like the atmosphere. There's different pressures, there's different temperatures, there's even different compositions. What are we talking about when we're talking about we want to map the oceans or the seabed, and specifically, in the context of Seabed 2030?
Well, mapping can mean many things to different people and different organizations. But if we look at Seabed 2030, earlier I mentioned that we are a collaboration between the Nippon Foundation and an organization called JEBCO. So just if you let me unpick that for a moment, JEBCO
Yeah, please.
is an acronym for the General Bathymetric Chart of the Ocean. And JEBCO's two things is a product, and more about that in a moment, but it is also a group of people. And JEBCO was established in 1903 by Prince Albert, Premier of Monaco, where a man who had huge philosophic interest in the ocean, he was a scientist in his own right, and he brought together a group of oceanographers, hydrographers, engineers, and mappers to start pulling together the first atlas of ocean depths. And JEBCO has been true to that ever since. It's moved clearly from paper in the early days to a digital product now, but JEBCO concerns itself with ocean depth information. So a 3D reference frame upon which all other science, all other ocean activities can be built. And Seabed 2030 is a subordinate project within the JEBCO program with a mission to accelerate JEBCO's aim, and JEBCO's aim is to provide the most authoritative bathymetric depth information to the world, make it free to use, freely available. And Seabed 2030 is an accelerator to try and force the community to think about mapping the ocean, to inspire the community to map the ocean, and to get it done as soon as possible, ideally by the end of the decade. And the JEBCO product, which I touched on earlier, is currently a digital ocean map consisting of three-dimensional reference frame, depth information only. So we don't concern ourselves with backscatter information. We don't concern ourselves with the water column information. It is purely depth information, because to do any more than that would expand the project beyond its capability. So we're very much focused on delivering a three-dimensional map for others to use for all the other ocean science that needs to take place within the ocean decade and beyond.
Right, I understand. So it's really mapping the surface of the bottoms of the oceans, and then delivering that to other people who are going to see how water might interact with that. If there's you were saying a tsunami, if there's other sciences that we might want to do. I understand. Okay, so it's creating this.
Yeah, and we're a relatively coarse resolution product. It is a reconnaissance tool, so at best we're looking at one depth value in a box that is the size of a European football pitch, broadly speaking, 100 meters by 100 meters, degrading to 800 meters by 800 meters at full ocean depth, because that is very much determined on the object detection size of a deep water echo sounder system. So we're not mapping at high resolution, absolutely not. We don't have the capability to do that, but we can produce a map of ocean depths that can be used by others to go back and do deeper exploration in those areas of interest, in those areas where there might be unusual features detected at that coarser resolution.
So the goal is to make a complete, even if not very high resolution, but you said between 100 and 800 meters, but complete map of all the oceans. And then other people might,
Yes.
I don't know, you're like, Mariana Trench is interesting. Let's go there. And so like people can go in do specific higher resolution areas. Yeah, it's actually very similar to what we do with satellites. We have some satellites, like again, those geosynchronous, they map the entire world at a very, very coarse resolution of sometimes kilometers. And then you might have some very, very high resolution satellites that are below a meter, but they have a very, very narrow set of view. I think of it as you have someone that's taking a panorama look, and then they have a very long zoom lens, but they can only look at a very narrow area. Um, yeah, I see. So 100 to 800 meters.
Yeah, and we have a variable resolution. Currently, the Jebco grid is mapped to 15 arc seconds, so about 480 by 480 meter boxes at the equator. What we are hoping to do within Seabed 2030 is to make that more agile, so to map at better, higher resolution in the shallower water, coarser resolution in the deeper water.
I see.
So have a
Oh, so it's a
variable
function of
resolution through the
depth.
water.
Hmm.
Absolutely. And but that's going to take time. We need to change the way the product is portrayed. But we have the base information to be able to fill those boxes with depth information in terms of the 26.1% that we've already mapped. What we do need to do now is expand beyond that and start filling in the rest of the ocean. You know, we've added, interestingly, in the year, we tend to launch the grid, announce the grid, the new figures in June every year. And between 2023 and 2024, we added 1.2% more information mapped. So that's about 4.3 million square kilometers. It doesn't sound a lot, but it's 9.5 times the size of Sweden. It's about 3.5 times the size of South Africa. And that is a huge amount, but we've still got so much more to go. We've still got 272 million square kilometers of ocean still to map. So it's a huge process, but we need to get people moving to do that. We need to mobilize governments in particular. We need to look at how philanthropy can help, how industry can help, and also citizen science. We're in a position where there are thousands, tens of thousands of vessels plying their trade across the ocean. If those vessels are moving into waters that perhaps aren't fully mapped, particularly in the deep water, if they've got an echo sounder and a data logger, we can accept what we're now calling crowdsourced bathymetry. When I was at sea, we used to call it passive sounding. It used to be done manually on paper echo traces. If you're transiting from one location to another across the world, you would submit your echo sounder trace to your National Hydrographic Office, and depth information would be extracted and used in the Jebco grid. And that's what we want to try and see more of now. We want it's easier because we have electronic systems. The logging of that information is much easier. We need to empower the mariner to help map the ocean through citizen science.
So this is part of what I wanted to get to. The project that you're leading is, from my understanding, it's more of a policy project. It's getting people together like on this specific project. You don't have, as far as I know, like Seabed 2030 boats and unmanned vehicles that are going there. It's really trying to put what is already out there together into this common project. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. And Jebco, apart from the fact it was established by Prince Albert in 1903, today that project, those volunteers sit under the auspices of two intergovernmental bodies. Firstly, the International Hydrographic Organization, the secretariat of which is based in Monaco, And secondly, the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO, the secretariat of which is based in Paris. And so we've got that high level United Nations member state support. We've just got to get on and mobilize the systems, and that's the biggest challenge because people have other priorities. If you've got a ship, you might be very focused on using it for clients who are interested in laying cables and pipelines and the infrastructure surrounding that. It might be looking at the siting of wind farms. It's not so easy to pull that ship off that task and divert it to some of the other areas of the ocean that still need to be mapped. And of course, who's going to pay? And that's the other challenge.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Like, how do you convince these people to go out and map specific
Well,
areas?
well, we've estimated that using modern systems, there is about 200 single ship years, so 200 years of a single ship time to get on and map the ocean. But as I said earlier, there are vast number of assets available. So if we mobilize them all, we could do it in 7 years. But there is a cost to that, and the cost, depending on the technology used, depending whether the technology we should be using is a blend of deep water systems, sonar systems. It's a blend of bathymetric lidar systems, cameras mounted on laser systems mounted on aircraft, or it might be satellite-derived bathymetry. Those latter two systems are great in clear, shallow water, but you still need sonar systems for the deep water. And the blend of that technology, we estimate, was going to cost somewhere between $3 and $5 billion to complete the mapping of our ocean. But actually, in terms of governments across the world, that's actually a relatively small sum. It's huge to private individual, but to governments and to industry and to philanthropy combined, it's a relatively small sum to invest in the well-being of our own planet.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised as well. That does feel like a relatively small number given the scope and the scale of the project. Is the goal to do this one time as well, like to have a reference? Or are you planning on also trying to uh, map continuously? Like, is there a point in doing that? Like, do we have an idea of how often the seabed changes?
Well, I mean, you make a very good point. The resolution we're mapping at is pretty coarse, so some of the minor changes will not be visible. But you make a good point. Where do we go once we've achieved the map? Do we need to keep mapping? Technology changes, resolutions people might want higher resolution products. Where do we go beyond that? But we're not there yet. We haven't actually mapped the ocean to the base
Yeah,
level.
that's fair.
Um, but but if you cast your mind back 2 years ago, or over 2 years ago, when the Hunga Hapai volcanic eruption took place off the coast of Tonga, we had to redraw the map of that area because it had to change the seabed. And we were very fortunate to be a minor participant in a project that was run by the National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research based in New Zealand and the Nippon Foundation to remap that area. And we Seabed 2030, as did the world, benefit from the output of that. We were able to remap the area high resolution to meet the needs of the Tongan people. But at the lower resolution, we were able to incorporate that new information into the JEBCO grid.
You've said like so there's an update every June. We just had one this year a couple months ago. 26.1 or
Yeah.
roughly around that area of the ocean is mapped. Okay. What does the other 75% look like? Is it really that we have absolutely no ideas? Like this area could be between 3 kilometers depth and 5 kilometers, and we have no idea what it looks like? Or do we have a range of like, we have some really, really, really coarse areas? Like, I just find this question so fascinating because I'm used to a world where on land mapping, we have the Landsat mission that's basically mapped the entire world sort of repeatedly for the last 50 years. This idea that a place is not mapped is just not one that I work and live with. I have to go for like land mapping. We have to go to specific planets and moons of planets of the solar system, and we already have like pretty good idea of most of them. Like we have some images. So this concept of it's not mapped is one that's pretty foreign to me. So I'm quite curious, what does that 75 other percent of the ocean
Okay.
look like?
So, well, yeah, again, you make a good point. So the basis for the Jebco grid is a product called SRTM 15, which is a series of values based on satellite altimetry. So every box, and I said earlier that currently at 15 arc seconds, every box in the Jebco grid has a value attached to it. But only 26.1% of those values are from observed depths observed by echosounder, depths observed through LiDAR bathymetry, or through satellite derived bathymetry. The remainder are derived from satellite altimetry. They're very coarse in terms of horizontal and vertical resolution. There are lots of other physical factors that go into determining those satellite altimetry values. And what we're doing is encouraging the world, inspiring the world to go out and observe depth values so we
Right,
can
I see.
replace those very coarse, crude satellite altimetry values with observed values. Now, that doesn't mean to say that those altimetry values don't have a place. They are absolutely better than nothing, but they're not as good as we need to make it to satisfy the needs of the world.
So SRTM, I'm familiar with that, the shuttle radar topography mission. Like I think it was in either 1999 or 2000. It's one of my favorite, coolest missions ever. They slapped a couple beam, like a giant retractable beam on the space shuttle. They put two radar antennas, and basically they were able to map nearly the entire world for the first time. Like one mission basically mapping the entire world. For the longest time, it was what we were using as the reference for terrain mapping of land as well. SRTM, if anybody's worked with um, digital elevation models, just mapping elevation, like this is a name that sounds familiar. I wasn't aware that this was also used for the oceans. So this is where I want to dig a little bit deeper. What does those coarse measurements look like today? Like what are we talking about? Like what's the uncertainty that we have for that 75% of the rest of the oceans? Like I'm really curious. Is it like a kilometer? We just don't know, or is it more than that?
It actually you the nail on the head. The 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 resolution is plus or minus a kilometer or thereabouts. Which if you think we're trying to drive that down to 100 meters by 100 meters in shallow water to 800 by 800 in deep water, that's a significant difference. But I'm not an expert in satellite altimetry, but the substrata of the ocean will also affect the vertical resolution. So it depends very much on the density of what is underneath the ocean floor as to what value you will derive.
Sure.
And therefore it is not as good as actually measuring the ocean through a sonar system.
Yeah. But okay, so this is what I wanted to get at. It's not that there is no. It's not like where some of these old time maps, paper maps, where we would send an explorer and like the borders start getting fuzzy and we just don't know what it is. It's like we have a just super rough idea of what it looks like. It's incredibly coarse. It's a few kilometers, and what we're trying to do with the rest of those 75% is trying to get that to a range that's acceptable given the scope of the project. So you said 100 meters by 100 meter in shallow, and then 800 by 800 in deep water. Back to how do we get that? I would like to dive a little bit deeper, pun intended, as to like how do we map that? So we said you've talked about the deep water sonar. Like, can you at a really really high level sort of explain how do we map the ocean depth, like the seabed? What does that process look like?
Generally, and I touched on this earlier, it is the use of a sonar system. So deep water multi-beam sonar system, swathes of beams. And if you want me to go to the really basic level, it is a transmission of a sound pulse from the hull of a vessel to the seabed and measuring the two-way distance. So listening for the echo and measuring the two-way distance and converting that to depth. Adding a number of parameters like the salinity and the temperature of the ocean to correct the sound path information and correct the depth values. But that's pretty much it at the basic level for a sonar system. And we're lucky that there are a huge number of organizations that are going out mapping the ocean, not as many as we would like, but we have partners who are out there conducting pure exploration, whether that's as part of a mission to go and discover new ecosystems, whether it's part of a mission to go and look at Earth processes in a part of the ocean. And whilst those vessels are at sea, they have the ability, and they do, switch on their echo sounders and they gather depth information alongside all the other signs. So we're a beneficiary of that. We encourage those organizations to think about ocean mapping as they conduct their business and to submit their information to the GEBCO product.
Right. So I wanna just hang on the sonar there for a little sec. So it's a sound. It's like the ping that you hear in the movies,
Yeah,
in a way. Like,
yeah,
you emit a sound, that can travel, like it's a wave that can travel through water.
yep,
It bounces off on what you imagine is the seabed, and then it comes back. You know the
correct.
salinity, the pressure, the temperature of the water, so you know the speed at which that sound wave goes. You roughly divide it by two because it goes back and forth, and then you know the distance of the floor. You're sending multiple beams at once in multiple directions, so you're able to get like basically an image of where you're going, and that's how you get terrain. Did I get that right?
Right. That is right.
Okay.
And if
And
you
then
if you've got a system that has got a swathe of beams, multi-beam,
yeah,
then you've got a searchlight system that can search either side of the vessel across the ocean floor, and you're picking up multiple depths across that swathe.
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's the thing. It's sound. So yeah, again, I keep making comparisons to satellites. And of course, you can't really use sound when you have a satellite that's up in space. There's radar waves a lot, and then of course passive. So you have a camera. Um, so then you put your sonar on a boat, or a uncrewed vehicle. Now, my question is, like, if I looked at the map right now that we look at those 26%. I'm guessing it's not like we chop the Earth in four and we have one grid. It's probably like across the most common maritime routes, these areas are mapped, and then everything in between we have like patches of holes a little bit everywhere.
That's it, absolutely right. Yes, yes. And normally, I've got a slightly different background here, but my digital background shows that in great detail. It shows uh, an open space, predominantly in darkness, where we have no mapping information, and then stretches of tracts across the ocean, polygons where perhaps a mission has been a science mission has been carried out, where we've got full bathymetry, but vast parts of the ocean. There's a little lattice, in fact, of areas mapped and areas unmapped. But sadly, the vast majority of those areas are still unmapped, and that's what we've got to get on and complete.
Right. And so that's where your job comes in, which is probably getting on the phone with people and saying, hey, can you, instead of going on a straight line, could you just like go a little bit on the side, or something like that? Like convincing people to go out there, like not necessarily individual boats, but like I'm guessing it's the industry, probably scientific missions, to go in these areas that aren't mapped necessarily as well.
Yeah, I mean, the Gemto map is published every year. It's free to use. It's free to download. We encourage those that are going out into the ocean to do whatever science or whatever exploration that they intend. They use that as a basis for planning where they might better fill in some gaps for us. And that happens. We've got lots of organizations that submit data to us. We've got lots of partners that want to go out and maybe adjust their track from point A to point B to cover areas where there is no mapping information and help fill in those gaps. But it's a huge effort, and there's a lot of ocean still to get
Right.
on and do.
So you said that map gets published every year. Last year, I think you said 1.5% was added to
1.2%.
1.2%. Okay, and so there's we've got 6 years till 2030. What do you think needs to happen for us to reach those 75? Like it's basically like 10% every year.
Well, 2030 is an aiming point, and every organization, every project, every mission needs an aiming point, and we're still aiming for that. But what we do need to do is get governments behind this. In particular, we need the mobilization from governments, and but also it needs to be in partnership with industry. And also the other thing, and I haven't touched on this yet, is that there is undoubtedly huge parts of the ocean have already been mapped, but the information has yet to be shared, and it's not been shared for a vast variety of reasons, and we need to work around that. Quite often, it's been gathered at high resolution. It belongs to a client that maybe is using it for business purposes, or it's subject to an academic embargo. We need to try and free that up, and we need to free it up at a resolution that the organization is comfortable to release. So going back to my point that the Jebco grid is a reconnaissance product, it's pretty coarse resolution. We're not asking for high res data. We're not asking for state secrets to be shared. We're not asking for commercial sensitivities to be exposed to us. We simply want low res data to incorporate in the Jebco grid. But of course, that brings a problem in itself, because if you've gathered at high res, you then need to allocate some sort of resource to filter it down, and that's where the cost comes in. Do you have the people in your organization that can spend time doing that? Is it in the right format? Is it a proprietary format that only your organization uses? Who are you going to give access to it to desensitize it for release? And that's something that challenges all these organizations that hold that information. But we work with them to see how we can work around this and to share at a resolution they're comfortable with without compromising the investment they've made in that, or the investment they're going to make from that, depending on what the original project was.
I understand. Do you have an estimate of like if you could have all these academic projects and they would magically downsample all their imagery to the resolution that you would want, and like basically without we would never send a boat again, just with what we already have, and we downsample it to the resolution that we want. Do you have an idea of like how much is out there already?
Yeah, I make a guess that between 15 and 20% potentially of the ocean has already been mapped, in addition to what we have covered.
Okay.
But that information is yet to be shared.
Okay.
So we need to work on that, and we're working with our high-level stakeholders, the International Hydrographic Organization and the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO, to look at freeing up that data. And UNESCO run a corporate data group that's looking to work with industry partners to see how some of that information can be freed up, how we can desensitize it, how we can lower the resolution and make it shareable.
I picture this as a sort of like little game theory point of view, or like you have to think about in terms of incentives. I'm imagining that the reason for if I'm a private company and I've sent my boats and I've mapped at a very very high resolution, the use case that I can think of is for underwater cables. Is I don't know how common that is, but like the all the basically the pipes that move around data. I don't know anything about that, but that's just the thing I think of first. I'm imagining I'm the company responsible for that. I probably have incredibly high resolution mapping of these areas, and you come knocking at my door and you're saying, "Hey, can you like spend a little bit of time and do this at just like 800 meters for us? That'd be great." I can imagine it's a lot easier of a sell if you tell them you're going to give us this, but then you get access to like basically the rest of the map as well. Like you're going to give us this, but this is a part of a project and it's going to be open, so you also benefit from all these other areas that you haven't mapped. Like speaking the terms that someone in an industry would probably understand. I'm imagining it's a lot of like give and take with getting people on board with a project like that.
It is, and if you're in industry, your aim is to keep your company afloat. Your aim is to keep your shareholders happy. Your aim is to keep your clients happy, and diverting hard-won resource to do, I don't know, to desensitize data, to filter it to a lower resolution for a project on the side is not always a business priority. It's time, it's cost, it's resource. So we really need to push the message. What we've done, and we're hoping to release these later this month. We've produced a series of 12 use cases on a project that has been running for a few years now. We've reached out to a whole host of stakeholders across all sectors, and we've come up with some use cases that highlight the importance of having an adequate map, whether that is for tsunami prediction, whether it's for cables and pipelines, whether it's for wider exploration, whether it's for other aspects of the hydrographic or oceanographic industry. And those use cases are designed 2-3 page publications to make the point to those who don't have time to read pages and pages of words why it is important to have an adequate ocean map. So we're hoping those will influence some of the decision makers, some of those that need to make the decision to either release information already held or to go out and make the case for wide area mapping.
I want to take a bit of a step back. I think of maps as like we can talk about the technical aspects of getting the map and the resolutions and all of that, and the partnerships that need to be made. But for the longest time, map, and still to this day, like maps are a thing that you hang on your wall. I have like one here. I have a globe up there. It's a thing that there's the engineering and the science that goes behind it, but at the end of the day it's still a thing that you hang up on your wall because it's pretty and it's cool, and it's like this feat of like humans just like going out there and knowing things, and like maps are just I think about these as the embodiment of like we know, like this is the place that we live and we know what it looks like. And so like every once in a while I just look at it and I'm like, wow, it's actually impressive that we just know what the world looks like. Do you ever just like look at it and just like look at new areas that we've mapped, just like we didn't know what it used to look like and now we know? Do you just spend some time opening it up and like zooming it?
I've got a globe behind this screen. I spend a lot of time just looking at it. So I'm thinking, well, I wonder what's there. We have on our parent body's website, the JEBCO website, we've got downloadable maps. So people and organizations can download that map. You can print it off. You can stick it in your wall. You can look at what's there. And of course, if you venture more deeply into the JEBCO grid, you can look at some of the the areas that have been mapped, and you can see some of the underwater topography in in its glory, really, and you can see what we're missing. And we've got some very good colleagues at the University of New Hampshire who've produced what I call a spinning globe. It's available for on their website, but you can it's got the Jebco grid overlaid onto a globe. You can zoom in, you can change your angle of flight, you can see some of those underwater canyons, you can see some of those underwater mountains, and it is truly amazing to look and see what is down there that we already know is down there.
Is there a place that isn't part of that Jepco grid that you would like, just personally, like you would like there to be? Like it just, I don't know, for, personal reasons or whatever. Is there just like a place where you're like, I can't wait for this tile to be
I think we need to go and explore Point Nemo. So the point that is the furthest distance from
right?
land, and to be able to get that mapped and into the Jebco grid would be a serious achievement.
So the point that's like furthest away from any land, that's right. Is
Yes.
that where the maybe I'm confusing the two, but is that also where like the space graveyard is, where we just put all the space junk?
Absolutely, it is,
Right.
because it's so far from land. It's the safest place to be able to land in the ocean, space craft and their components that have returned to Earth from a mission. But yes, so wouldn't it be great to be able to get out there and map, and knowing that is the furthest point from every bit of land, but also we know that there's a lot of stuff down there. So let's get on and map it.
It's in the. I'm just trying to look at. So I have this like giant. I actually have a globe. It's on. It's in the Pacific, right?
That's right. Yes.
It's somewhere like, yeah, basically just the furthest you can think of. Let me grab that globe. I want to see if I can find it. So, okay, I have this like tiny little globe. It's somewhere like roughly like in.
That's about right. Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
right. So for people that are just listening, you basically look at the Pacific. When you look at the globe, like all you can see is water, and you take roughly a point in the middle there. Like we're really far from anything. So like sending a boat or even a uncrewed vehicle, like that's probably like days or weeks of just going there in the first place. Like
Correct.
that's why it's hard to go there. Like it just
Absolutely.
physically takes a long
Why
time.
I want to see the challenge. Somebody please go and map it.
Yeah, it's like basically like going to the North Pole, like these expeditions to the North Pole. Like it's really far away, but in terms of mapping, that would be cool. Is it planned? Do you know?
Not to my knowledge. Not to
Okay.
my knowledge.
That would be pretty cool. I like that. I like that idea of I'm gonna go check out. I haven't taken enough time to go check out that Jepco grid. I saw on the website, there is a very cool visualization. I invite people to go check it out. How important do you think it is to get just like public awareness and public engagement, like people like me that are just nerds? How important do you think that is to get like people on board and just aware of all these efforts?
We absolutely need public support because the ocean is so crucial to the health of our planet. And again, going back to the point I made earlier, we need a reference frame. We need that 3D map on which to superimpose all the other work that's happening in the ocean, to be able to reference it, to be able to carry out climate change prediction accurately, have sufficient data fill for the modeling there, tsunami modeling. So we really do need them to make the point to the public how important the ocean is, not just as a source of food, not just as an area for leisure, not just as routes for trade, but the whole ocean being the driver for climate, the driver for climate change. We need to get that message home, and we need public support behind the need to fully map our ocean, to fully understand our ocean. And of course, the UN Decade of Ocean Science is key in that. We've seen a huge rise in interest because of the publicity surrounding the ocean decade, which incorporates a vast range of other sciences, not just mapping the ocean. But of course, we are part of that because the ocean map and a fully mapped planet is part of the ocean decade mission. But we need to keep pressing home the message as to how important the ocean is to us, why it's important to have a fully mapped ocean, and how it supports everything else that's happening in the ocean.
That sounds like a really nice place to round this conversation up. I'm just looking at this globe again. Like I just think it's pretty cool. I'm just like wondering again. Like this conversation is great. It's kind of eye opening in the sense that like I can look at these maps and I'm just like there's all these features, all these borders, all these cities, all these names basically that we've appropriated as humans, and then there's just empty. And I just never thought about it. I just never thought that like, oh yeah, I just take it for granted. Like yeah, it's kind of empty space, but it's not. And it's pretty cool that there's this project going on that where I think there's something like inspiring about it as well of like it's just kind of knowing. I like this idea that like humans just like doing things because they like knowing. And it's pretty cool. I look forward to being able to buy a globe like this one that I have that's just not empty in the rest of the areas. That's like
So do I. So do I. And
it's
that's what we're driving for within Seabed 2030 is to have that fully mapped globe, so you can spend time in your office looking at it and enjoying it, but also the fact that it is going to be used for as a reference frame for all the other important science that needs to take place in the ocean.
yeah, that's I can get behind that. I'm very thankful for this conversation because more than just the like how do we like we know, I like hearing the stories of how we know. So seeing the ever like maps is just such a fascinating, very visual way of showing how humans have gotten better at knowing stuff. Because you can look at earlier maps and like people like roughly had a good sense of the shape of areas, but you can see how they were wrong. And now we look at map and we're like, of course it looks like this. But like figuring out how we know that the Earth is round and that the continents have these specific shapes and that the rivers are there, like the stories of how people figured out that we know all these things, I find it just as fascinating. So this is just thank you for kind of humoring me and explaining to me like why it's so complicated, how the all the work that needs to happen, because it's very enlightening and it I don't know, it tickles my brain in a nice way to just know how humans are able to figure all these things out.
It's been a great pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for some really searching questions. And bottom line is we need to get on and map our ocean. Absolutely.
I before I let you go, I want to ask a couple more questions. Just like I like asking the first question when I start. I like rounding off these conversations the same way. I like asking for a book and a podcast recommendation, and there's a couple of reasons I do that. The first one is because it's a fun way to know a little bit more about what people are interested in. And the second is that books and podcasts, they really travel through word of mouth. It's really like, hey, I read this cool thing, you should check it out. So if you spend some time reading, if you listen to podcasts, is there anything that you would recommend people checking out? Not necessarily about anything that we talked about, but just something that you thought was pretty cool and you came across recently or not. So yeah, one book
Well,
and one podcast.
one book, Laura Pursue's book, The Deepest Map, which explains the race to map the ocean and the need to map the ocean, and some of the Gedco history, some of the seabed history, and also some of the great explorers that have been mapping the ocean, a lot of them contemporary. And then in terms of podcasts, I tend not to listen to many podcasts, so the only one I can really recommend hand on heart are the Seabed 2030 ones that my colleague Steve Hall runs.
That sounds great. I'll have links to those in the show notes. I'll put links to like a bunch of the things that we talked about. There's that on the website you talked about. There's this spinning globe demo. I really encourage people to check it out. I think it's really I like these visual artifacts of like, this is what we know and this is what we don't know. And so if people are curious, I really recommend people check that out as well.
I'll send you the
Um,
links to that.
yeah. Thank you so much for your time. This was a very fun conversation. I really appreciate it. So thanks for the time, and thanks for just walking me through all of this and kind of how we map the oceans. I really
Well,
appreciate
thank
it.
you, Max. Thank you. And thank you for your interest.
Hey, thank you so much for listening to this conversation. I wanted to take a moment to thank the sponsor of this video, but also all the people who financially support me on Patreon. If everything goes well, these conversations should feel and sound seamless and effortless, but there's a lot of work that goes behind the scenes. I try to research and prepare these as much as I can to know who these people are and what makes them interesting and what would lead to a good conversation. I'm incredibly thankful to all the people who support my work on Patreon, meaning I can do a little bit more of it. This podcast started out as a way to learn more about the people in this industry, but I've also started making educational content on another YouTube channel that I'll put a link to in the show notes. And I want to make more content explaining how satellite images and maps work to a broader audience, as well as continuing to research the guests for these podcast episodes. So, if you value the work that I do, I'd like to ask you to please consider supporting my work on Patreon. There's also some behind the scenes of how this podcast is done and some of the work that I'm doing for these educational videos if you want to learn more about how I do all of this. Either way, thank you so much for all of your attention and your time. I really appreciate it, and I hope you get value from these conversations. Thanks.